Hi, Jonah Latta here. Today we're going to talk about how to tie the frameworks together. So we have covered a lot of frameworks so far in this course, and we've learned them as separate and distinct concepts. And so today we're going to say, well, how can we tie these together to sort of analyze the situation and tell a story about what's going on with a particular company? All right, so our learning objectives for today are to explain how the frameworks and concepts tie together to analyze a business situation. Our objective is not to go through each of the frameworks and explain the framework. So the idea is that you understand these frameworks already, and now we're going to make linkages across the frameworks so that they make sense together in your analysis of a situation. Okay, so the frameworks that we're going to talk about today and tie together are the general environment, that's our GD-PEST analysis, the industry environment, which is Porter's 5 forces, the value price cost framework, our generic strategies, which is the cost leadership, differentiation, the broad versus focused, value chain analysis, stakeholder analysis, our inside the firm internal analysis, or the resource-based view. We're going to talk a little bit about organizational structure, agency theory, and leadership. Okay, so those are the concepts. And you've seen them all pictured like this throughout this semester. Okay, so GD-PEST is that external environment. The 5 boxes, that's our Porter's 5 forces. The 2x2, that's our generic strategies. The 3 boxes on top of each other, right? That's our value price cost framework. We've got the value chain. We've got our stakeholders. We've got the VRIS analysis, and we've got an organizational chart. And so, as a good exercise for you and a mental exercise for you is to really think about how you would tie these together. There is no one right answer to this. There are many different ways to think of it. It's not in a textbook that says this is the only way to think about it. And if there's a way that you think about it that works for you, then you should stick with that and you should use that. So in this slide, you've got the frameworks shown more from a figure standpoint. And the idea is there's some space on the page here for you to make the connections across the frameworks. And I would argue that you could do this in 50 to 100 words or less. Okay, so take the time and try to come up with a way that ties these frameworks together. Okay, so now hopefully you've taken the time and you've tried to tie these together on your own and see if there's a way that you think about them. So again, the idea is not to explain this is what Porter's 5 forces is, but to think about how does Porter's 5 forces relate to other concepts that we may have talked about. All right, so if you haven't thought of a way that ties them together, this is just one approach. And again, there is no one right answer. There's many ways to think about this. All right, so here we have a firm competing in this industry under these environmental conditions. All right, so we've looked at the firm, Porter's 5 forces, and our GD-PEST analysis. And that firm chooses a particular strategy, and in this case, it's a cost leadership strategy targeting a broad market. And it has an advantage because in this particular case, you see in the middle box, we've got the firm's profits. Because it's a cost leadership strategy, it is driving that cost line down. And in doing that, it's increasing the firm's profits. Okay, so we've got the firm choosing a cost leadership, broad market strategy, and it has an advantage because it's driving costs down. So that firm chooses specific value chain activities to support its cost leadership strategy. And those activities are going to differ. If it had a differentiation strategy, those activities would look very different from what you would see here with a cost leadership strategy. And part of doing the value chain analysis, you're thinking about where does the firm add value, what activities might you outsource. The value chain activities must at least minimally satisfy the various stakeholders. So in our case, we were talking about capital market stakeholders, product market stakeholders, organizational stakeholders. We can then use our VRIS internal analysis to analyze the firm's value chain activities. and we could evaluate them and say, are there some of these activities or some of these capabilities that provide an advantage, some of them that we need to invest in and develop them in order to be competitive. Then we need to think about our organizational structure, right? So we've talked about structure follows strategy. So as organizations change their strategies as they grow, then the organizational structure needs to be changed to support that strategy. So now we're thinking about structure as a way to implement strategy. And so in this case, this is a single business firm, a business level strategy that we're talking about, and those tend to be functional type structures. But the things to think about are really, where is profit and loss responsibility, right? So in this case, it's at the top level of the organization. Who's making the decisions? Where's decision-making responsibility? How are you going to monitor and control? And what incentives might you have in place to incentivize the right behavior? And lastly, we have our top management team, our leadership team. We have a board of directors is elected by and represents our shareholders, and they provide oversight of the top management team. So they are there to represent the shareholders' interest, because as you see, our leadership team, our top management team, is separate from ownership, right? So we have this separation of ownership and control or decision making, which creates that agency issue. So our agents, our top management team, they set the direction, they manage our resources and capabilities, they're influencing the culture and the ethics of the organization, and they establish the controls to actually manage the organization. Okay, so in this case, we now see how we have tied together a lot of the concepts that we have covered in the course up to this point. And in this approach, we've taken an outside-in sort of look at things. But again, I've said that there isn't just one way to do this. There are many ways that we can do this. And so I'll propose another way that we may be able to think about these things. So here's another way that we can think about doing this. We can say, here's a firm with certain value chain activities, and it's competing in this industry. All right, so in this industry, right, we have competitors that have cost leadership or differentiation sort of strategies, right? They may be targeting a broad market, or it may be a focused niche market, right? But we have our firm here that has certain value chain activities, and maybe these are some other competitors with different value chain activities and different target markets. All right. So this is the firm that we're thinking about, right? So it has a cost leadership strategy, and it's after a broad market. It's targeting a broad market, all right, in an industry. And here's the rest of the industry, all right? So this is the rest of Porter's 5 forces. So we have our potential entrants, we have our buyers, we have our suppliers, and we have our substitutes. Okay, so we have our firm that has these value chain activities, competing in this particular industry using this strategy, and we may be able to look at the activities of that firm using our VRIS analysis to analyze specific resources and capabilities or activities to see which provide an advantage and which may require development, right? And then once we're thinking about that, then we can look at the organizational structure, right, and say, how do we organize, right? So here we've got our top management team, and here we may have our accountants, we may have our engineers, we may have our ops, we may have our finance, we may have our marketing team, right? So we have to organize to implement our strategy, all right? And then the last piece to tie in here is really all of this is happening in a broad external environment. Okay, so we've got that broad macro